A major bust by the Rhode Island State Police. 41 kilograms of fentanyl off the streets tonight, and now 3 people are in custody.
I don't want them in our country. Their country is no good for a reason. Their country stinks. We're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Minnesota had been quiet for years. Too quiet. Behind calm streets and polished neighborhoods, federal intelligence was tracking a darker reality. Fraud, drugs, and violence tied to illegal immigration networks embedded within parts of the Somali migrant community operating in plain sight. At 7 a.m., the silence broke. Across Minneapolis and surrounding areas, IC tactical units moved simultaneously. Engines roared, radios crackled, neighborhoods were sealed before residents fully understood what was happening. Doors were knocked, then breached. Suspects were taken inside homes, on sidewalks, in vehicles, and inside warehouses, all under federal authority. This was Operation Midway Blitz, a joint ICE, DEA, and FBI operation launched after massive welfare fraud investigations revealed Somali illegal migrants with criminal records living comfortably in upscale neighborhoods, while millions in stolen public funds remained untouched. What began as immigration enforcement quickly escalated into a battlefield. Within days, agents seized over 300 LLB of fentanyl, 160 kilo of cocaine, and military-style weapons, shotguns, AR-15, stacks of cash, laptops, and forged passports. In just 2 weeks, more than 550 suspects were taken into custody. Then the real shock emerged. Evidence pointed to CJNG, deeply embedded in Minnesota, exploiting illegal Somali migration channels to move people, money, and drugs across the Midwest. DHS raised the threat level to Code Amber. This was no routine sweep, it was the opening shot of a domestic security war. If you believe criminal networks should never be allowed to hide behind silence, hit like so this story reaches more people. Based on federal investigations and classified filings reviewed by investigators, what analysts uncovered next triggered an immediate alarm. At the center of the network was Ibrahim Warsame, alleged Minister of Foreign Affairs, 56 years old. A senior government official with diplomatic access, international credibility, and the ability to move across borders without drawing suspicion. Publicly, Wars appeared untouchable. He spoke the language of reform and humanitarian duty, presenting himself as a protector of immigrant communities and a trusted partner of international institutions. Cameras followed him into conference halls. Doors opened when he arrived, but according to investigators, classified financial reviews revealed a far darker reality. Federal analysts identified 47 unexplained transactions and 11 shell companies deliberately layered to conceal ownership and intent. Funds moved with precision from Guadalajara to Panama, then Mogadishu before re-entering the United States disguised as development grants, logistics contracts, and diplomatic consulting fees. Investigators describe this not as chance corruption, but as designed infrastructure. Encrypted communications escalated the threat from criminal to strategic. Investigators say FBI cyber units intercepted messages allegedly showing Warsame issuing approvals, coordinating shipments, and resolving disputes at the highest level. He was not on the margins of the operation. According to the filings, he was directing it. The communications pointed to direct coordination with CJNG, alongside cooperation from extremist-linked networks across the Midwest that supplied weapons, vehicles, and armed escorts for secure corridors. The methods were ruthless and calculated, investigators allege. Minors were recruited as couriers for their invisibility. Church facilities were allegedly used as transfer points, shielded by public trust. Criminal records were quietly altered or erased, allowing operatives to pass background checks and move freely. Then came the most dangerous revelation. A closed network identified by investigators as a shadow council had allegedly protected the operation for 6 years. Somali businessmen, local power brokers, officials who understood exactly how to exploit the system while remaining insulated. At that moment, according to federal assessments, Minnesota crossed a red line. This was no longer an immigration issue, no longer a routine criminal case. A sitting foreign minister allegedly embedded in a transnational cartel structure meant one thing. The threat had reached the level of national security. When power and crime collide, where should the line be drawn? Comment red line if you believe no one should stand above the law. The briefing reached the White House just after midnight. Stacks of classified reports, financial charts, intercepted messages, names of officials highlighted in red. When the final assessment landed on the president's desk, the conclusion was unmistakable. This was no longer a regional crime problem, it was a coordinated infiltration of American institutions. Within hours, President Donald Trump authorized an unprecedented federal response. "This is not about politics," he said in a televised statement later that day. "This is about protecting American communities. We will dismantle every cartel network, every corrupt official, and every criminal operation hiding inside our country." No one is above the law. The order triggered a nationwide alert. Before dawn, FBI, DEA, and DHS launched a joint strike unlike anything Minnesota had seen. 12 high-value targets were identified across the state. As night gave way to morning, helicopters swept Minneapolis while armored vehicles rolled through surrounding cities. Tactical teams moved with military precision. At the center stood the most sensitive target, the private residence of Ibrahim Wars. Federal agents stacked at the gate. A final confirmation came through the headset. Then breach inside. The illusion collapsed instantly. What appeared to be a dignified home concealed a hardened command space. Agents uncovered 86 kilos of heroin and fentanyl sealed and marked for distribution. Hidden compartments revealed 24 unregistered firearms, including modified rifles and suppressed handguns. Walls gave way to secure rooms lined with servers and encrypted storage. Then came the discovery that shifted the operation into overdrive. 6 encrypted hard drives were seized, each one containing meticulously organized files, names, payments, protection schedules, travel clearances. One folder stood out above the rest, stamped with a simple label, Assets. Inside were records tying 19 Minnesota officials to money laundering operations and deliberate obstruction of criminal investigations. Court records altered, background checks erased, warnings quietly redirected before raids could happen. The cartel had not just bought protection, it had engineered it. Across the state, similar scenes unfolded. At one warehouse, DEA teams intercepted chemical supplies linked to fentanyl production. At another site, ICE agents detained coordinators preparing new migrant routes to replace those already compromised. FBI tactical units neutralized armed resistance at 2 locations, securing suspects without civilian casualties. By mid-AM morning, command screens lit up green. Target after target confirmed secure. President Trump addressed the nation again that evening. "We are taking our country back," he said. "This operation proves what happens when law enforcement is allowed to do its job. We will defend our borders, our cities, and our institutions, and we will not stop." As evidence trucks rolled into federal facilities and suspects were transferred under heavy guard, one reality settled in across Minnesota. This was no longer an investigation. It was a declaration. America was no longer reacting to infiltration. It was striking first. If you support decisive law enforcement action to protect American communities, share this video so others understand what just happened. When the raids ended, there was no pause, only a deeper descent. Inside a secured federal facility outside Minneapolis, rows of evidence crates stretched wall to wall. Phones, laptops, ledgers, hard drives pulled from false walls and buried safes. What agents had seized in a single night would take months to untangle. And everyone in the room understood the same truth. The real damage was hidden in the data. FBI cyber units worked around the clock. Encryption was stripped layer by layer. Communication logs revealed years of coordination. Meetings scheduled under diplomatic cover. Payments routed through charities. Instructions disguised as policy memos. Every decrypted file confirmed the same pattern. This network had been designed to survive scrutiny. Financial forensics teams followed the money. Small transfers, $40,000, $70,000, $90,000 moved constantly, never large enough to trigger alarms. Shell companies in Minnesota funneled funds into offshore accounts, then recycled the cash back into the United States as investments and community development projects. On paper, everything looked legitimate. In reality, it was a laundering machine. One analyst summarized it bluntly. They didn't hide the crime, they normalized it. As the investigation expanded, Minnesota's role became clearer and more alarming. This was not just a destination. It was a distribution hub. Drugs entered from the southern border, passed quietly through the upper Midwest, then moved east and north along freight corridors, highways, and rail lines. Migrant labor networks doubled as logistics channels. What looked like ordinary movement was in fact precision supply flow. The human cost surfaced next. Case files showed minors recruited as runners, promised money or protection for their families. Others were coerced into silence after crossing the border, their identities absorbed into the system and erased from official records. Several names appeared once and never again. Investigators marked them as unaccounted for. Federal prosecutors began assembling parallel cases. One track focused on narcotics and weapons. Another targeted corruption, obstruction, and conspiracy. Quietly, subpoenas went out. Bank accounts froze. Travel privileges were revoked without public explanation. For those involved, the walls were closing in, but they wouldn't hear the breach coming this time. Inside the task force briefings, one phrase kept reappearing: institutional contamination. The cartel had not relied on fear alone. It had relied on access, exploiting diplomacy, bureaucracy, and trust to embed itself inside the system. That realization changed everything. This was no longer about dismantling a criminal ring, it was about repairing the integrity of governance itself. By the end of the week, new warrants were prepared across state lines: Illinois, Wisconsin, North Dakota. What began in Minnesota was spreading outward, exposing connections investigators hadn't even known to look for before. Outside, life appeared normal. Schools opened, traffic moved, neighborhoods stayed quiet. But beneath that calm surface, the investigation was accelerating, methodical, relentless, irreversible. The raids had won the battle. What followed was the war of exposure. And once the truth began moving through the system, there would be no way to stop it. The truth doesn't disappear. It only waits to be exposed. Comment: show the truth if you believe corruption must always be brought into the light. The morning after the raids, Minnesota woke up to a different reality. Outside federal buildings and detention centers, crowds gathered under gray skies. Some held signs calling for compassion. Others demanded answers. News cameras lined the sidewalks as community leaders, activists, and families tried to understand how a state long viewed as stable and safe had become the center of a national security operation. For many residents in Minneapolis and surrounding cities, the shock cut deep. Ibrahim Warsame had not been seen as a threat. He had been seen as a protector. His name was tied to speeches about inclusion, stability, and opportunity. Now that image had collapsed overnight, replaced by sealed court filings and armed federal escorts. Community organizations moved quickly. Churches opened their doors to frightened families. Immigration attorneys worked through the night, tracking detainees transferred to federal holding facilities. Parents asked the same question again and again. How did this happen without anyone knowing? Public anger followed confusion. At rallies, critics accused federal agencies of going too far, arguing that the operation had cast fear across entire neighborhoods. "You don't fight crime by tearing families apart," one speaker said into a megaphone. Social media flooded with competing narratives. Some framing the raids as collective punishment, others calling them long overdue. But inside the IC and FBI command centers, the response was firm and measured. Officials stressed that the operation was not directed at a community, a religion, or an ethnicity. No names were released, but the implication alone sent shockwaves through city halls and county offices. Meetings were canceled, statements were rewritten. Silence replaced confidence. For some, the operation became a breaking point. Calls flooded legislative offices demanding reform, stronger oversight, tougher asset seizures, and clearer accountability. As night fell and protesters dispersed, one truth remained unresolved in the public mind. Were these raids an overreach or the only thing standing between order and collapse? That question echoed across dinner tables, radio shows, and town halls, and while opinions clashed, the consequences of inaction were no longer theoretical. The community had been shaken awake. What came next would determine whether it learned from the shock or repeated the mistake of looking away. As the public debate intensified inside Minnesota, federal intelligence was already looking far beyond state lines. What investigators uncovered was not just a domestic criminal operation. Drugs moved north from Mexico, but influence moved differently. Money flowed through Panama and offshore banking corridors. Communications passed through encrypted servers overseas. Diplomatic access provided cover. What appeared to be isolated corruption was, in fact, a transnational strategy designed to test how deeply a cartel could embed itself inside American institutions before triggering a response. The conclusion reached in Washington was blunt. This was not only about fentanyl, guns, or money laundering, it was about sovereignty. When a foreign-linked cartel could leverage migration routes, manipulate public trust, and compromise officials inside the United States, the threat crossed into the realm of national defense. Borders no longer ended at geography. They existed inside financial systems, political offices, and community organizations. Federal agencies adjusted their posture immediately. Homeland Security elevated intelligence sharing with allied governments. Treasury analysts coordinated with international banking authorities to track illicit flows. Law enforcement briefings began to include language once reserved for counterterrorism operations. The objective was no longer disruption alone, it was containment and deterrence. One senior official summarized the shift quietly during a closed-door session. This is how modern infiltration works. No uniforms, no invasion, just patience, access, and corruption. Minnesota became a case study. It demonstrated how criminal networks could weaponize humanitarian systems, exploit democratic protections, and move faster than traditional enforcement models. But it also demonstrated something else. What happened when those models finally aligned? ICE, FBI, DEA, DHS, and federal prosecutors had operated not as separate agencies, but as a unified structure. Intelligence moved without delay. Jurisdictional barriers dissolved. The response was decisive because the threat demanded it. International observers were paying attention. So were other criminal organizations. For the first time in years, cartel leadership faced an uncomfortable reality. The United States was no longer reacting after damage was done. It was anticipating, intercepting, and striking early. Financial pressure replaced chaos. Exposure replaced secrecy and access. The cartel's most powerful weapon was being systematically stripped away. Yet officials remained clear-eyed. CJNG would adapt, routes would shift, proxies would change. That was inevitable. What mattered now was the precedent. Minnesota proved that infiltration could be identified, mapped, and dismantled even when it reached into places once considered untouchable. This was the larger warning embedded in Operation Midway Blitz. The fight against transnational crime is no longer confined to borders or streets. It is fought in data centers, banking systems, legal frameworks, and public trust. And in that arena, hesitation is vulnerability. As intelligence briefings closed and preparations for the next phase began, one message resonated across federal agencies. America's greatest strength, openness, can never again be allowed to become its greatest weakness. The operation in Minnesota was not the end of the story. It was a signal the era of invisible infiltration had been exposed, and the response, now global in scope, had only just begun. The truth that emerged from Minnesota was larger than any single raid, any shell company, or any cartel corridor. It was a reminder of something far more fundamental. When institutions are trusted without being questioned, they become the perfect place to hide. And for years, that is exactly what happened. Criminal networks embedded themselves inside systems built to protect the vulnerable, turning compassion into cover and silence into a weapon. As details of Operation Midway Blitz spread across Minnesota, public reaction became its own story. Some communities were shaken, others felt vindicated. Many struggled to reconcile the trusted image with the uncovered truth. Church leaders held emergency meetings. City councils debated late into the night. Parents felt unease walking children to school, processing the deep penetration unnoticed. From confusion, a clearer message emerged. Citizens began asking tougher questions about failed oversight and ignored warnings. Calls for reform surged. Advocates demanded transparency. Local officials faced unprecedented pressure. Minnesota, once calm and insulated, awoke with determination. This would never happen again. This story is not just about infiltration or federal action, but the importance of vigilance. Corruption starts quietly in small compromises and unchecked influence, in believing some are untouchable. Minnesota's events shattered that illusion. No title, diplomatic badge, or favor can shield wrongdoing forever when truth emerges. A community that refuses to look away cannot be controlled. Informed citizens questioning perfection and demanding accountability through awareness change systems. Institutions strengthen. Infiltration fails. This was a warning and turning point. Minnesota found vulnerability and resilience. Agencies unified. Public learned silence is not safety. Awareness is. If you believe such stories must be told and corruption exposed wherever it hides, support this mission. Like to spread the truth, share to reveal what's beneath the surface, subscribe for the unfolding chapters. The story is not over. Together we will keep bringing the truth to light.